Hey, my name is Jay Gordon. Welcome back to AzureFunBytes. This time we're going to talk about Visual Studio Code. Let's get into it.
Visual Studio Code, or VS Code, is a streamlined code editor with support for development and operations like debugging, task running, and version control. VS Code is free, available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. You can use VS Code to handle anything you want to write thanks to integrated programming languages support right out of the box. Popular languages like Python, C++, C#, JavaScript, Ruby, PHP, and more.
Hi, I'm Jason Hand with the Azure Cloud Advocacy Team. Visual Studio Code provides a number of extensions that allow you to integrate your development process directly into Azure. You can create resources, interact with the Azure CLI, or even right-click deploy a web app. It's all there for you in Visual Studio Code.
Extensions allow you to install or even create your own plugins to extend the features of VS Code. Today we'll focus on Microsoft Azure extensions. There are large collections of extensions you can find in the VS Code marketplace that make it easy for you to build and host applications on Azure. I'd like to deploy a web app from VS Code to Azure App Service, so I'll install the Azure account and the Azure App Service extensions. Once I install my extension, I can go ahead and authenticate my session with Azure using my credentials and multi-factor device. Once that's complete, I can right-click on my app's root directory and select Deploy to Azure Web App. I'll configure the service plan, the web app, and then VS Code will deploy my web app and provide me details when it's completed. And just like that, my app is online.
For more information, documentation, and even to get $200 in free Azure credit, go ahead and click this link below. Once again, my name is Jay Gordon. You're watching AzureFunBytes, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, welcome back. My name's Jay Gordon, and once again, you're watching AzureFunBytes. Another opportunity for us to talk about all the different fundamentals of using Azure. Thank you always for being part of this show. There's a bunch of you who always take part in every week in the comments, and really appreciate it. You help show what we can do by working together. We learn in public. And I think that that's a lot of fun. And one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to learn in public about a really interesting topic, Visual Studio Code. It's an IDE, an integrated development, whatever environment for you to go ahead and actually build your applications. But the thing that's really great about VS Code is it integrates into so many different third-party tools, but it also integrates directly with Microsoft Azure. And that's really what we're here to talk about. And to help me through all this, I was lucky enough to get someone that I've spent some really cool time with on the road. We talk here and there, and about all the different things in the world. He used to watch me do a lot of baking, and I think we had some cool stuff to talk about it. This is Chris Norig. Hi, Chris. How are you today? Let me unmute you, would you? Hey.
Hey there, Jay. I'm good. I'm good. How are you yourself?
I'm doing great. It's been a rainy day here in New York City. How about where?
Well, there's been a few thunderstorms, actually. We had this heat wave going for 4 or 5 days at 35 Celsius. I think that's close to 90 something in Fahrenheit.
And would you tell everybody what city you're in?
I'm based in London.
Very cool. So we are two very, very metropolitan gentlemen, New York City and London, and we are here to talk a little bit about Azure. But before we do that, I want to get a chance to let people know a little bit about you, Chris. We got to meet a bunch of times on the Microsoft Ignite the tour. We're part of the same great organization, different teams, but we get to be part of that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about, how you got your start, how you got to Microsoft, where you're from, all that kind of stuff.
Right. So I'm from Sweden. So I moved into UK 4-ish years ago. I started my development journey in, 2006. I was a .NET developer at the time. I was doing Visual Basic .NET, like a lot of us. I spent roughly a decade on the .NET stack. Started then with the JavaScript full stack, and still spending most of my time in Sweden, living there, born there. I was born in the capital, Stockholm, but I moved down to the west coast in Gothenburg.
Great city. Love Stockholm. Beautiful city.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So much water, right? And I'm the archipelago type of person, nature scenes, all that, right? And of course, metal.
I like the music there too. Big fan of the music there.
For sure. I mean, I was born and bred on, anything black metal. So I think that's where we've been talking a bit, right?
Yeah.
Metallica, Iron Maiden. Yeah.
Sure. I really love that, and not to get too into music, but some of the people that watch appreciate we talk about cool music. Excuse me. But I really love the Gothenburg kind of death metal revolution that came through in the 90s that led to bands like At the Gates and In Flames and all these huge, and even Dissection and a bunch of other huge death metal bands to grow. And everybody knew all the black metal that, tons from Norway and stuff from Sweden. But, the death metal is what really made me that, Entombed, you name it. That's my stuff. So anyway, we don't want to bore everybody with all of our metal, but what we can do is let people know that we're going to actually talk about some technology today. And I think that what we're going to do is going to help enable you, is the best way to describe it. I want you to get an opportunity, like everyone else, to learn more about Azure. And so that's one of the goals that Chris and I have here today, because we do this for a living. We help people learn about Azure, but I think, Chris, you and I can kind of help people learn Azure through a very, very common tool that I think that's become one of the more popular ones, and that's Visual Studio Code. So what's your experience using it so far, in your career?
I mean, I think like most people on the .NET stack, I kind of started on Visual Studio itself. And then I kind of gradually, as soon as Visual Studio Code was out, I was starting to use JavaScript more and more. So I was doing Angular projects. At that point, it made a lot of sense to me to because I was on a Mac, to use VS Code. It was really, really great for JavaScript. And it started to have all these nice extensions, which made my life a lot easier, right? You could lint, you could run your tests, and it could be infinitely extended. So I think a lot of people kind of jumped on that boat as soon as it was out. I remember having some other IDEs now that I'm forgetting the name of, but yeah,
I definitely used some less good ones back in the day, and there were a number of Mac ones, if I recall. They were all little different types of editors, and while they did some highlighting, they didn't really do things like completion. And so they were limited in what exactly their use case was, but they were useful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I came from the Visual Studio, right? So I was kind of spoiled of having everything out of everything. I mean, it's always been known for being that feature-packed, IDE. So starting with JavaScript, I was, as you mentioned, I was using these IDEs or text editors that didn't have that many features. So as soon as I got to VS Code, I kind of noticed that, hey, here are actually features and it's free, right? So it became an easy buy-in for that reason. I think that it was an easy transition.
So what's great about Visual Studio Code, and I've got it up here, is that it's a free download. And so if you go, everybody, to this link, I've got it here and highlighted or in the chat, it's a free download, and it's available for just about every possible operating system that you've got on a desktop or laptop computer. You can use it. There's even, this is one of the things I think is really super cool. I'm going to show them, if you don't mind, Chris, before we kind of get into it. So we've got obviously this Visual Studio Code here, right? We go here into the Cloud Shell in Azure because we're talking about Azure today. We've got our own version here, and then we've got Visual Studio Code Spaces, which is an online version of what we're using. So what's great is that there are multiple ways to utilize Visual Studio Code. And let's take a look at it. Connect to CodeSpace. This is even an online version that we can share with different team members if we want to. So it's so, I guess the best way to put it, it's portable, it's capable, it's extensible. And what's really cool is it's got all these extensions which are open source. And here's the little thing I wanted to show everybody, Chris. So I've got the Cloud Shell in Azure open, and just open the standard bash. And if I just type code and dot, which means the directory that I'm currently in, I've got another slightly different version, a little bit stripped down, but another version of code right here. And what I can do is pick out the applications or the different files that I want to change. It's all here. I can make edits and close the editor. Still a lot of that syntax highlighting all those things. And I think, Chris, when you think about the availability of this, I think it makes it a no-brainer for people to kind of utilize this really simple but very, very powerful tool.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that stripped down version, as you mentioned, you can even have it in Learn modules, I think. So, I mean, even if you don't want to install Visual Studio Code, you can still kind of get that experience, right? So, I mean, this thing is integrated everywhere. And one thing you mentioned about code spaces that's really interesting is that I remember back in the days when I was, on Visual Studio, because I was a consultant for the longest time, right? So I moved ship every 9 months. I went to a new customer, and then they would say, hey, Chris, you need to install these extensions or run these scripts so you have the exact same environments as everybody else. And then came code spaces. And suddenly you can just specify exactly the code environment that you want your team member to have or a person on a workshop, right? And I think that's where code spaces really shine, that you can have that, everyone has the same environment, and you can actually ship something and say, hey, just do this, and you will have exactly our environment. You're up and running within a few minutes.
And so one of the things that we like is consistency and repeatability. And I think that that's one of the things we get out of VS Code that integrates into other real common tools are that the reliability, the dependability, and the ability to do things dependably with plugins to all these modern cloud tools that we have to us. Like, why do things manually when it's automated? Why make it hard when there's an extension? And that's kind of the way I look at it now,
I mean, so one thing I've noticed as I got into this cloud business was that, in the beginning, I started thinking like, hey, there's a portal here, but I'm a developer, right? So I want to stay inside of my editor, and I don't want to leave unless I have to, right? And as I learned more, I discovered there were Azure CLI, for example. But once I saw all the extensions, I kind of realized, hey, I can just stay here in my nice cozy cabin and install all these extensions while still talking to my cloud accounts, my resources, and doing everything, right?
And I
So
think it's a. Go ahead.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I said that's actually a great way to segue into the first kind of problem that we're going to solve. And that's, creating a development environment that we can share, that we can use, we can do things with. And I think that we can integrate what we're doing with Visual Studio Code with a lot of the other tools here in Azure. And so I think one of the things you and I are going to kind of talk about today is how to work with static applications. So I'm going to start with the super, super easy way of doing it. Then I'm going to let you kind of take the next step. You think that works?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to do today, just to kind of get us started. And we've worked with this before, and we focused a little bit on storage, but I think that we can just talk about what we're going to do. I am going to open up a static website that I have in my Git repository. And this static website here, it's about my old buddy. He's not with me anymore, but he was a really good dude. His name is Rico. I made a website about him because I really liked the little guy. We don't have to get too much into that, but the point is that I made this little website, and it's just a simple static site. I keep it in GitHub so that we can get to it quickly when I need to. And what I want to do is I want to show you how we can clone this repo into this application here, Visual Studio Code. And then what we're going to do is make sure it's connected to my Azure account so we can do a simple deployment. So it's just, we're not going to use any major services. We're just going to use some blob storage. It'll take me just a few minutes too. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do is we can go back here, and I'm going to just open up a new version, new window for code, and it's going to actually allow me to clone a repo. So I can go to, let's see, where's that clone a repo thing here, Chris?
Probably an extension, right?
So if we go here to more, I think what we can do, I think
It's a command
let's
right?
go. So
maybe.
So clone repo in Visual Studio Code. So the reason why I'm doing this live for you is this is the way you would learn it. You know what I mean? When you need to find out where something is, you go ahead and you look up the docs. So this is the doc. So let's go ahead and throw it in the chat. So this is how to go ahead and clone a repository. So what we can do is just hit the command palette and go to the clone repository button. So let's do that. So let's do Shift Command P, and this will be different for every different operating system. So we're going to clone from GitHub. Cool. And it wants to sign into my GitHub account. So you can see that there are all these integrations that we can use. So I'll go ahead and continue, sign into my, don't worry about it. We're just going to sign into my account. Uh-oh. Success. We're good. Open. Now we can actually see that's an integration that is part of Visual Studio Code. So it's the ability to actually connect live to my GitHub account and then start to look at my repos. So let's find the repo that we were talking about back. And it was Rico the Pug. Let's find it. So we can actually type it in and it'll complete it for us. Ooh, I just had it there. There it is, right at the top. Cool. So now what it's going to do is it's going to ask me where on my computer we're going to actually keep it. We'll just put it right on my desktop. And now we can open up right here in Visual Studio Code what was in our Git repo. So now we have a local version if we want to make some changes. And what we could do is we can go to content, we could make a change here. And then if I wanted to, I could use the, there is GitHub tools based where I could just do point and clicky, or I could open up the terminal. So this is a great thing, Chris, that I love. I love the terminal built in here.
I have a question for you, Jay.
Sure.
Have you heard of an extension called Peacock?
No.
So that's a coloration extension that you can search for, and what it will give you is different colorations for different backgrounds. Because me as a developer, I end up with 4 or 5 instances. I can't see which one is which, right?
So let's go here. So Peacock. So this is how easy it is to get it. So you go here to this extension selector on the side. You'll type in the name of the extension. You'll click install. It'll give you some information, and there we go.
It's installed globally, and now we have the ability to use Peacock. And I think all we got to do is refresh my session.
Yep.
Is that what I need to do?
So you need to invoke the command palette again. So Control-Shift-P if you're on a Mac,
Okay.
and
sure.
And you
1
should
second.
be prompted. There we go. And start typing Peacock. And you should have something that says enter color or something like that. Yeah, you got some pre-selected options here, right? So it can be like with Peacock green, for example, but there's one there called enter color.
Oh, there you go. That's really cool. I get why it's called Peacock, because, you know, peacocks are colored, they're visible. That's very cool. So thank you. You taught me something. Why did my mouse start? Thank you, mouse. At least my mouse came back. All right, so now we've got this. It's more visible. And what we can do, and I'll make it a little bigger, I just want to deploy the public static part that's already built. We could talk a little bit more about Hugo, but I don't really want to get into that today. But essentially, we're using Hugo to generate static pages. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you that there's some integrations with Azure that we can use. So you can see I've already installed them here, but let me show you the extension themselves. So if I go here into extensions, let me make it a little larger so you can just see more. The extensions marketplace, we can just type in Azure. And you can see there are all these different tools for Azure, different types of highlighting for things like Azure Resource Manager, Azure Functions, and Chris will talk a little bit more about that. I know there's an ability to build Azure Functions natively with all the completion of the different ways of, we'll get into that. I know you know tons about that. And then we can even integrate Terraform, so we can make sure that when we build Terraform, there's an extension specific. So there's all these options. And so the things that I did was, one, I signed in with my Azure account. And so all I did was click enable, and then what it did is it prompts me for a username, password, my two-factor, and then eventually it authenticates me into the session for Azure. Then what we can do is, I don't know how to delete those things. I will delete spam at another time. Thank you, spam. Anyhow, what we can do here is essentially add different extensions for different products on Azure. And in this particular one, we're going to use storage. I think this is a real easy one, Chris. And then I'm going to let you take over a more complex one in the next round. So what we can do with this storage module is, if you see, we can use the storage module to work with blob containers, file shares, tables, and queues. And the great thing that Azure allows you to do is use this particular extension to deploy to a static site using a blob container. And all you need to do is right-click. So if Damien was here and he saw me right-click to deploy, he would be very disappointed with me. And Damien, very, very awesome dude when it comes to this stuff. He and I have talked about this before. He was on before. Anyway, we want to deploy to a static website, and we're going to just do this now. But in the future, you don't necessarily always want to right-click to deploy. You want to integrate CI/CD methodologies, and Chris is going to show you one of the things that we can do with that eventually. So we're going to go deploy to a static website, and I'm going to just sign into Azure, use my Azure account. So I'm going to show you what came up. Is it brings up an account chooser, and I can just choose my username and password that's authenticated. Once I'm authenticated, now we can go back here, and it's going to ask me for a storage account. Excuse me, I got to do that again because I clicked the wrong spot. So let's go ahead and click deploy to static website. We'll see all the different things associated with my account, all the different subscriptions, so I can pick my subscription. This is where we're going to build this. And so next what we're going to do is create a new storage account, but I like picking advanced because I want to do some special stuff. So now I need to create a container, just give it a name. I'm just going to call it Chris and Jay because we're hanging out, Chris, right?
Yep.
Enter. So now we got to create a resource group. And the best way I like to describe a resource group, that's an empty carton of eggs. And we're going to throw some eggs in there. And if the eggs go bad, we can pull them out. And if all the eggs go bad,
we can throw the whole thing away and not have to pick each one out. That's the way I like to think of them. So now it asks me, do I want to enable static website hosting? Now, Chris, this is not the best way to do it, but it's a way to do it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, for sure. I mean, Azure Storage is definitely a good way to show your static files. So, I mean, we have many services, and this is quick and simple.
Sure. So I want to say yeah. And after, I have to give the name of the index file. And in this case, in my website, if you go under here to public, and you'll see there's that index HTML. Great. So we're going to state that's great. Now a 404, almost the same exact thing. We got 404 right there, Chris. I could just put 404.html. And then I can select where we're going to put it. East Coast all day. Sorry, I'm a New Yorker. I'm going to put it there. And so now what's going to happen? Let's talk about it. In the background, Azure is going to use an API call to Azure, or I should say VS Code is going to send an API call to Azure Resource Manager, which is the unified management layer for Azure. And it's just an API call that says, here's all the stuff I want. And when you're done and you've created it, I'm going to give you some files to put it in. And so that's exactly what we have happen as we go through the process of creating the storage, making the storage web accessible, and then uploading it. So we're done. It deployed. And now if I just click Browse to Website, we can see the website about my dear friend Rico is there, and all the information, you name it. And so what we can kind of see happened on the other side of it, and I think then we can kind of move on to what's the next step of doing this, Chris. You know, we built an application, we cloned it, we deployed it via VS Code, but let's show them where it is in Azure first, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So if I go to resource groups, that's where all my egg cartons are. You can see I've got a bunch of egg cartons with a bunch of different dozen eggs with different applications that make up those dozens. And so I'll click Chris and Jay. And within here, you're going to see a storage account was created. So this is a standard storage account based in the East US availability, I should say region. And that's replicated across all the different availability zones, making sure that we have this locally redundant storage always available. We have it hot so that we can always get it. It's not in cold storage. That means we can get these files that are associated with a public website quickly, because we don't want to have a public website in cold storage. That doesn't make any sense. And so the thing that's great about using this, Chris, is I look at this like a pamphlet. If I need to put a pamphlet on, and I don't think it's going to change very much, and I just want to leave it, I think blob storage with static hosting is perfect. I don't need to worry about it. I just make it once, throw it up there. Rarely should I have to think about it. I can go here to storage. I can see we have web. I can actually go and look at logs if I want to. I can use some log processor to get some statistics on who's coming. And then I can actually do things like configure cores, do encryption. And here in the static website, we can even do some customization so that this primary endpoint, which is a fully qualified domain name with SSL, is customized. And then we can do things like add a CDN, add search. All these things are just really, really simple storage and static hosting ideas. So we don't have to get too crazy. But and I'm going to pull this out now, Chris, and go back to us directly. So we've built a website in just a few minutes using Visual Studio Code. We put some extensions to work. Now the thing is like I said, we talked about me using blob storage, which was great. But the thing about it is that I don't know about how we get past the pamphlet unless we do something more than that. And so let's say we get past the pamphlet website, and now we need to be in a situation where we need to update it. And we need to make sure that those updates work and that there's no big failure in the process of providing updates. And I think that this is where, Chris, you and I can kind of take that next step of the story and talk about if you wanted to use a Visual Studio Code to build something and then deploy it to another type of static website. So why don't you I'm going to go ahead, and if you want to set your screen to VS Code and then share your monitor, and then what we'll do is we'll let you kind of tell us a little bit more about what you're going to look into. So I want you to teach me, all right?
All right. Let me know when you can see it.
You're all set. You're live.
right.
Go for it, man.
Super. So I wanted to back up the tape a second there, because you
Sure.
talked about a static website. I can imagine a few of you who are building those are thinking, hey, I got something that's not going to change so often, so maybe I just spend a few minutes of handcrafting HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and that's it, right? I mean, so imagine that you are at a point where you're saying, hey, handcrafting becomes painful because suddenly I need to spend all that time to go in, and what was that HTML tag again for creating a list, or how do I show a link, for example, right? Most developers out there are thinking, hey, I don't want to deal with the raw metal here. I mean, I like metal, right? And you like metal, but we don't want to be that metal when it comes to HTML. So what we do is that we look into some frameworks to do this for us, right? Because so there are all these frameworks. There are, like, for example, SPA frameworks that helps you build web apps, like Angular, React, Vue, or Svelte, for example. I mean, yeah, sure, Jay, you might be looking at your static website, and that might be a very simple thing, and you're thinking, why do I need to download X number of megabytes of JavaScript just to do this simple thing? Well, it really depends, because if your simple website is meant to be combined with other kinds of data, it can still remain simple. So imagine that your simple page is not just a page for Rico, right? But there's a lot of other people who want to contribute a lot of information to that, and they might have their favorite photos, or they might have stories or links, and all that data comes from different data sources. But you still just want to combine all of that, and you want the end result to still be simple. So what you end up doing is probably go fish on the internet and say, hey, can I have some kind of simple framework or tool to combine all of my nice friends and relatives' memory of Rico, right? And just combine all of those into this nice site. And yeah, sure. I mean, you might look into things like Hugo or Gatsby or frameworks like that, because that's what they're built for. They're very, very good at taking different kind of static data and just combine that into one nice app that ends up creating HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you feel at some point that your app needs to grow a little bit more, that it needs to talk to a backend, maybe a few of those pages in there needs to be dynamic, then you might actually think, oh, it makes sense for me to look into React or Vue, for example. So that's what we're looking at here inside of Visual Studio Code. I have a React app, right? And it's SPA, right? I mean, you might not even get there if you start with your simple site, but let's say you do. Let's say you have a couple of pages, and maybe you want the ability to have people note down their email, and you can send out an email newsletter, right?
Sure. So you want to create a situation very common of like, hey, I have a thing and I want to get back in touch with you after. So here, give me your information, but let's not have to worry about the old way of creating web forms and having something as a, let's do something that's a push as opposed to an always hosting thing. So you use what I think are like serverless processes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if I were to take a very simple static website, in this case, it's quite simple. It has an app component and a products component, right? And so imagine suddenly that I have some kind of serverless API. By the way, serverless is really great if you are in a hobby project, for example, and you want to try things out, because I mean, it has a free tier. And it's you only pay for what you use, pretty much, which means that you got millions of calls to this thing, and if you're the only one trying it, or your relatives or your friends, you're still not going to hit that limit. So serverless is very good starter backend technology, right?
Sure. And if anybody's watching and you have questions on serverless or anything on VS Code, please send us some of your questions. We'd love to hear. Both Chris and I really want to know that if you're curious about something, what we can do to help you learn more about it.
For sure.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. So we're looking at the root of the project, which is a React application, right? We've seen it has a few simple components. We've seen here that we have a products.js component that does a fetch. It does so towards the backend, and it fetches some products in this case, and it ends up displaying those and setting the state of the app. So we have some kind of for loop going on here, and the end result is a list of products. That's all good, right? But we mentioned the backend. We mentioned we wanted the capability of a simple backend. So here we also have this API subdirectory. And inside of here, we have kind of scaffolded up our serverless application. We have this endpoint route here that runs. And what it does is to be very simple at this point. It's pretty much as simple as the front end. It has a static list of products. Could be anything in here, right? Could be your the people on your email list, for example. And it ends up just returning that if we were to hit that endpoint. So just by combining these two relatively simple technologies of React and serverless, we suddenly have a full stack application that has the capability of, yes, sending out emails, but it could do so much more if you were to hook up a database and various integrations, right? But
So
we
you're
don't want
not
to make
spending
it too
time.
complicated.
So you're not spending time like with boilerplate, essentially. Like I have to write an integration for some sort of like single sign-on, or I have to write an integration for a common service, rather than have to actually put a whole portion of your application dedicated to just that process, like a database connection. You're using a serverless or an Azure function specifically as kind of a way to just take that need, simplify it into just some small code, and then have it as like a triggered based event. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. So what we're looking at here is the backend, right? So now we kind of shifted environments, and now we see Peacock working for us. I can see the difference between the front end and the backend. So
Pretty, very nice.
I've literally just taken this subdirectory API and shown that instead, right? So to get here, if you were curious about how you actually would get here, you would have to type and first off install the Azure Functions extension. I believe you could show them that at some point. The point I wanted to make was not to show all that journey, but to say this is simple. This is not something you should be doing by hand. You should be using these kind of commands, because this would scaffold the entire project for you, and you can easily add functions as you go, as you need more endpoints. So I have done this bit. I have taken create project. We're just going to select that just to see, give it a few seconds, but essentially it's going to ask me for what directory am I standing in, what runtime do I want, and some other information. So I end up with these scaffolded files. At this point, I haven't done anything, right? And I get this first function also with the function app once I created. And I've selected here in the past when I did this to have one endpoint on the products. And the products is a very simple thing. It's just an array that it returns as a JSON. And what I can do here is actually get this thing up and running. So I could be selecting my terminal here. So we can see a few things that goes on. And I could just do either with debugging or without debugging. What I'm doing here is I start compiling this thing, and it's going to end up showing me, hey, I've got an endpoint that you can hit. And once you hit that endpoint, you got some kind of data back. Now, and looking
so
at this,
that build is just local on your local environment, right?
Yeah,
it's not using. And if I'm right, that code spaces though allows you to do little builds and stuff like that within containers itself too, right?
Yeah, for sure. And even if you're using code spaces, which means you got a cloud environment, you can definitely open up ports. So you can sit at home in your own free time and connect to someone else's code spaces where they open up a port, and you can go nuts with code spaces in that aspect.
That's very cool.
For sure.
So your app is up, or your app built, and it's ready for whatever the next step is, your function, correct?
Exactly. So there's one little thing we need to do before we venture back to our React application, because now we have a backend that's up and running. Note here the port 7071, which means it's being served localhost 7071. We need to do a little entry here, which is essentially CORS. And CORS is about us being able to share resources across different domains and saying, it's okay if you come from Jay's computer and, call Chris's API, and Chris's API can say, hey, it's Jay. Of course, I'm going to give him my data, right?
And to let everybody know, that's to do things like avoid cross-site scripting attacks, essentially ways that people can create intrusions into your application. We can avoid that and that's one of the great things about using cores. It's a technology that definitely has become extremely important to the web, since we don't work in a world where singular domains provide all the data. That has been gone for a very, very long time.
Yeah, for sure. And if someone here is worried about the fact that it says course star and what that means, it means that I can work with this locally in a way that's easy for me as a developer, right? Because I don't want to be told locally, hey, you can't talk to this backend because it's on a different port than you are. I mean, as you were saying, it's all about security, about being able to safely talk across domains. But if you notice here on the left, we had a grayed out file. So this file is not going to follow us to the cloud. So we can safely set this setting and know that it's only going to happen locally, which is great for local dev, right? And even if you're a bit sloppy as a developer, I mean, you're only human, right? You might leave this in, but you don't have to worry about this setting hitting the Azure cloud. So we can safely add this entry. And now we have kind of prepped our front-end application so it is able to talk to this backend. Now,
Gotcha.
what we need to do here in React are two things. We need to, one, tell it where to find this API. And the way we do this for convenience is that we go into a package JSON and we add this entry, this little proxy property.
So basically it knows to use the proxy to essentially push the individual backend command.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why we're entering this proxy is because we don't want to have to change our code between our local dev environment, our production environment, right? We want the code to remain the same. So if you go in here and look at products, we don't want to have to type the full localhost 7071 address, because that means before we deploy, we would need to go in here and change that URL. So instead, we're just saying, hey, I think that you reside on API products. So at this point, this property here from package.json, this proxy will say, hey, you're going towards /API. I know what that means now that you have a proxy. So if you do /API, I'm actually going to interpret that as 7071 localhost, which is our API.
Gotcha. So how would we take this to the next step? Because I know that Azure has a specific a static app, web app hosting that's a little bit more advanced than the one we showed. And I was curious if you show what's the next step?
Right. So once you establish that, okay, I got a setup that works for me locally. One of the things I always do as a developer, or I hope I do, is to try to run things locally. Because I mean, with all these settings, it should be working locally first, and secondly, it should be working on production if I choose to deploy. So if you bear with me here, Jay, I would like to just quickly show you. This one is up and running locally. I would just like to start this one up, because if it works locally, it's an increased chance it will work on the cloud as well.
That's the hope.
That's the hope and that's the dream, right?
Yeah.
So we wait a few seconds here for React to build things, and because it's React, it's going to, we're going to disconnect you like so we not bother with all the other stuff, right? And so here we're looking at the localhost 3000, and it needs to think for a few seconds before this thing is done loading. There we go. Now we have our application up and running, and at this point it kind of looks like your static app, so it's not that exciting, right? But if you instead look at products, you see that we have two entries, and these two entries actually came from our API, because as you noticed, we went to /API/products, and it knows to proxy this into our function app. So at this point, we are fairly sure that our setup is going to work. And now we go back to talking about Azure, right? Let's go back here. So there's no reason for this React app to be running locally. Because we have installed a bunch of Azure things. There we go. I think I've installed every extension that Azure has published ever. But
and there's a lot of them, and that's the great thing about Visual Studio Code, is that these are all there available for you.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let's see if I can get this up a bit. My scroll. There we go. Okay,
I just want to show everybody something really quickly before you really get too into it. What with the kind of product we're going to be talking about moving forward here. One second. We've got this static web apps product, which is kind of like the next step up from that code thing that we drop directly into a blob storage. In this case, we're going to be able to create a CI/CD pipeline with this product with GitHub Actions. And I think that in itself is going to make this whole process that much more powerful for the moving forward. Because like I said, the way to look at the pamphlet was really easy, but we can't really think about it long term, because the pamphlet, we won't really be able to do things like test our changes and ensure that a fix doesn't break in the process of deploying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we definitely have a pipeline extension, so we can be setting that up, right? And the whole point of having a pipeline, at least if you ask me, is the ability to test out your code, make sure it works on different environments. And there are usually a few other steps like bundling it or running domain-specific tests on it. And just to ensure that what you end up deploying is something that's actually vetted against several different tests, right? And yeah, I mean, static web apps as a service here, it kind of offers some of that. I mean, this is still somewhat of I wouldn't call it a lone developer experience, but it definitely gives you that continuous deployment feel. And let me explain what I mean with that, because static web apps kind of assume that you have a GitHub repo with your things, just like you showed with Rico's site. And it also kind of assumes that every time you do a change to your GitHub repo, that you want this thing to be redeployed. Now, even if that's not true, you can kind of configure that a bit. So maybe you just want it to trigger on a pull request, for example. But yeah, so let's have a look at this extension, right? We have the static web apps service or extension. Note here how it's in preview. I mean, this thing was released in May, I believe. So it's still in a preview.
And still free.
And still free. It definitely has a free tier. And I believe a lot of premium tiers and all of more functionality is coming once it goes global access. That's how we name things on Microsoft when we say that it's freely available. We are supporting, very large apps and operations.
Sure. So you want to show me how we can deploy to it?
Yeah, for sure. So here I kind of select my Azure account. So what I can do here, if I quickly just browse the different functionalities, is that I can be creating a static web app, or I could be adding HTTP function or refreshing, or even go to docs, right? Because as you showed before, you might have a need to look something up. How does this thing work again, right?
Absolutely.
We don't have much things going on here, right? So what we want to do is to create a static web app. So we select that. And what it's going to ask me to do the first time I do this is to say, hey, I want to talk to your GitHub. And for that reason, you need to authenticate me towards GitHub.
Just like our previous process with me before. So we're authenticating, we're using two-factor, we're using all the methodologies that come with the embedded authentication and authorization with GitHub and with Azure.
For sure. I mean, I think if you start using it with the Azure account extension, I think you get the hang of it. We've just switched from Azure to GitHub in this context, right? So here I've started to type the name of my web app, the Chris and Jay awesome web app, right? And I enter the name, and here I can actually select different branches. So let's say, for example, that you have a branch that you want to try out, and you want to show that a specific feature that you want to see if my customer is going to like this feature. So you might not go with the master branch, but maybe some other sub branch. But in this case, we're going to go with the master branch because we don't have much going on. And then this is the interesting part. So now bear with me. There are a few selections you need to do when you do this. And if you only have a very simple app, if you only have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you're only going to care about where your application code exists. And
so this is a lot like our previous web app, that where all of our contents after it was generated was just in /public. So that's the only place we needed to serve.
Right, exactly. And my repo is even simpler than yours. We don't even have it in a /public directory, but rather in the root. So I'm going to go with / in this case. But you might actually have a repo where you have a front-end app in the same repo and a back-end app in the same repo and some other service that's also there. We usually
So you
call
can
this
specify your different API points, stuff like that, if you need to.
For sure, right? But as I said, this is a very simple thing. But if I were to have a subdirectory called frontend where this frontend app live, I would type frontend. But because I don't have that, it's in the root, I'm going to go with / here. Once I've done that, I have the option to be using a backend. And in this case, a backend is Azure Functions. If I don't have that, I don't need to worry about this one because it will only execute and try to build the backend if it exists. So you're kind of scot-free here. You don't need to think about things if you don't have a backend. I do have a backend, right? I have my function app, so it resides under the API subdirectory. So I go with that. And this last one, this is interesting because this is where your built files will end up from the front end. So if you have a SPA framework, for example, those front-end dist folders might have reside in different places. So because this is a React app, that a dist folder is called build, but it might be called something else if you're using a Vue app or Angular or Gatsby, right? So I'm just going to go with build. If you want to find out what this directory is, you can definitely use whatever tool you have, if it's Vue or VuePress, and see what kind of dist folder it creates when you run a build command. But you don't have to worry about this part so much, by the way, because if we mess this up, we can always go into YAML file later on and just change all of these settings. So there's no reason to be too nervous about these selections. So now Now we're getting a little entry not found in cache. That's an interesting one. So what we're going to do for this is to simply reload the window. You know how it is with computers, right?
Yeah, when you do it and you do it live, something always happens.
I believe we call that the demo ghost, and that's why we have videos. I do have that if we need that, but hopefully we won't. Now it's going to take a few seconds, and depending on my internet, it's going to say a few things. Just making sure, yes, we are inside of the React app. Yes, we're inside of Azure, and this is fun. It's telling us things. And we're going back to our static web apps. We are going back here and creating a static web app. Chris and Jay, let's do this again. We select master branch. We select here's our code. We're selecting here's our backend and our build folder. Yeah, now you see, just to reload and it's
now
all
we can
good.
pick the region, sure. And so because this is in preview, it's only in a limited number of regions. And
Right.
that means also that this is limited because it's free. There's not much that we offer in the way of extensibility. It's very limited, and it's because we're making sure that it works right for you, so that when we go to a full-blown global release, that everything has been figured out. And so that's one of the great benefits. So go for it. Let's go.
For sure. So
Awesome.
now we selected East US because I believe in my app should be close to you, right? And
Thank you.
Now it says I have actually been creating this static app, Chris and Jay, and we clicked on a link that said Actions, because what we need to realize is what it built is GitHub Actions. Now, even if you don't know what GitHub Actions is, for context, they are instructions that helps to build and deploy your application. Those are quite powerful. If you haven't played with those, I recommend having a look because they can really make your life easier in terms of building and testing your code. They're a bit like, how do you say this? They're not quite there when it comes to pipelines, but you definitely have that feeling of DevOps where you try to run different things on your code. Right, so here we can see it goes through different steps. We see that it's trying to do something. So here we have a trigger condition in which it says, hey, I've queued up this work, and I'm going to try to do my best to actually build this. So now we're going to build and deploy.
And what I love here is that everything you can see, it's visible. It's active logs in the browser. I like that. Like as a sysadmin type, I like to be able to have things visible. So actually watching things happening in the background via GitHub Actions, using the build environment that it has, which is not on your local computer. You get to move that build environment remotely. It's just cool. I like watching it.
For sure. I mean, it's pretty cool also to see all these checks going green. So it's a kind of a good feeling, right? There are a few warnings here, but there are things that you're going to see locally as well.
But you can put tests in your process, so you can have all of your tests that for your particular language and the unit tests. You can have them, and as part of this CI/CD process, we'll make sure that those tests pass and that you are deploying reliably too. I think is the best thing to think about here.
For sure. So what it is providing you with that I haven't shown yet is a workflow file. And in that workflow file, you'll see all of these action that takes place right now, such as building and deploying. And as you mentioned there, Jay, we can definitely be adding different tests to it and but you still have this starter pack, if you will, right? So now it's saying in green, happy days, finished upload, polling on deployment. And once it's done polling and get an answer back from Azure that everything is a go, we can actually go and see, hey, where's that URL for our app?
And so one of the big things that I do know about this static web app service that you should all know is when you initially create a web app, it asks you for a name that has nothing to do with the host name. Right now, the host name service is completely randomized. If you wanted to add a custom domain name, there are methods for you to do that. You can CNAME something. The point is that you could just name something, and it's more of an identifier than it is what it's going to be when it goes online.
Yep, for sure. It's fun with this one, right? Because sometimes it takes a couple of seconds, and sometimes it takes a few more seconds than that. But so once it's done doing that, you will actually have a deployment that's good and ready. Let's see if we see something in this.
Yeah, I was going to say, would you bring up the portal for me? Or you don't even need to do it in the portal. That's right.
Right,
that's
exactly.
one of the great things. And so there you go. So we don't need to see this in the portal. We can actually see the static web app available right here. So we never went into the portal to do any of this work.
Exactly. So, I mean, we could either be inside of the extension and see, hey, we got our Chris and Jay entry here. We could also look at things that I talked about before, which is the workflow file. So we can actually be pulling from our repo now because Azure has actually added a file to our repo. So if you go here,
and you see that funny end of the host name, or I said the funny name of the file, that's the host name that is generated for you randomly.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't like that host name, we definitely have like the opt-in option of customizing a static domain. So this is where it kind of differs from Azure Storage. Is all of these services are set up and it's ready for you to kind of add it. Azure Storage is great, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you don't even know what a CDN is or why you need one, or you don't know how to set up a certificate. A lot of these things are kind of baked into this experience with static web apps. So here in to the right, we have our workflow file, and the workflow file it's written in YAML, and we don't need to worry so much about how YAML works. But what we do care about is to find those selections that we made earlier. As I said, if you mistype this for some reason, you could go in afterwards and kind of change your selection. So here we can go in.
I'm just curious.
That's a good question. We could actually be going here inside of our extension and say, hey, we want to browse our site.
Oh, so you can browse the site directly. Cool. So then you open that up and it'll bring up the browser with the, I know it always takes a second because it's spinning. Oh, so there it is.
There is our app. So we see that those GitHub Actions actually eventually were able to ping Azure and it said, hey, I'm up and running, all good, happy days. So what's interesting here is first we're looking at the home route, right? Which is just rendering boring static data. Well, I mean, static data could be fun too if it has images. Don't get me wrong here. But you might have this products route instead. And we know that products goes towards our serverless API and fetches data, right? And if we click product here, it actually responded. So what we're seeing here is our front end talking to backend, and that backend is serverless. So we have a full stack application that we can make as complicated as we want if we involve integrations, database, and all those things.
And you didn't even have to log into the portal. That's the thing that really works for me.
That is
Hey,
the
Chris.
super cool part, right?
Hey, Chris. I think we got through it today.
We did.
We're pretty much done.
Nice.
And I really think that this was awesome. You taught me a bunch of stuff about how the deployment works in VS Code. I got to show people my own little things. We know how to make further changes because we can clone our repo, make changes to our repo. We can push the changes. We can create pull requests within all these extensions. Allow you to really make VS Code something for you to basically be your entire development suite, top to bottom. So, Chris, thank you so much for being part of this with me today. What would you like people to do, know, be part of? Well, how can they find out about Chris?
Right. My IMs are almost open. Probably the easiest way to reach me is Chris_Norig on Twitter. I believe it's listed here in my profile. But I also want you to go and check this out if Azure Static Web Apps could be a good fit for you. And it's scrolling here at the bottom. So SWA Docs, that's where it's a very good place to start. We have quick starts, we have learn modules. But most of all, make sure that you have that great feeling of staying inside of VS Code, right? Because you have extensions. There's almost no reason to go to the portal, as you saw here. I think that's the feeling I want people to leave with.
Awesome. Well, hey, Chris, why don't we give everybody a great goodbye and thank you so much. So, hey, everybody, thanks for watching this week. Chris, thank you. We'll see you next time on Azure Fun Bites. Chris, stay awesome. Thank you so much for doing this with me today. All right.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Bye-bye, everybody.